I think that this response would have been fair if we would have seen that in the past 8 years the international community would have tried to do something about the missile launch at Israeli citizens. In the past 8 years we haven't seen anything, any act or any statements from the UN which have seriously challenged the violence inflicted by Hamas on Israeli civilians. And also it is still very clear for everybody that the operational definition of Hamas is to expel or exterminate any Jews on the land of Israel. And as long as it doesn't change this statement and this goal of them, nothing can develop from this situation.
Both of you, let me just jump in there because we're joined by a guest in Jerusalem who I'm sure will want to respond to what you're saying. You're welcome to talk to him as well. And those of you watching, if you want to respond as the conversation goes along, the email address is worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com. Let's bring in a physician, Mark in Jerusalem. He's a regular on World Have Your Say's radio edition. Good to have you on BBC World News, Mark. Do you feel that your country is able to do whatever it wants?
I don't think any country can do whatever it wants, and I don't think that Israel in any way wants or thinks it can do whatever it wants. It's been very, very careful in this terrible time to not do whatever it wants. I mean, I think anybody who was battered, as Avi had said, for 8 years, for this long, by this many missiles, would feel like doing a lot more than we did. I think we're doing as best we can, given that Gaza is a built-up city, a built-up territory, very hard to hit Hamas people without hurting innocent civilians, and all of us in Israel are sorry about that. No one wants to hurt civilians. But we get the feeling that Hamas does want to hurt civilians, and I'll just tell you a brief tale from my own life. I work in Beersheba, which is in the south. I work in the Soroka Hospital, an 1,100-bed hospital that serves the entire south of Israel. We're just a few kilometers from Gaza, and we have missiles coming at us all the time. Why in the world would Hamas claim that they don't want, that we're hurting civilians when they're shooting at a hospital?
But Mark, let me just come in here, though, because we have Adwan here,
Sure.
a Gazan living in London, who says he feels that since the Israeli offensive into Gaza, the world has really stood back and said, you can essentially do whatever you want. There hasn't been any firm response from the United Nations, from the Arab world, from anyone saying that there has to be a line drawn and you've got to obey it.
It's interesting that you say the Arab world. I think you're right. The Arab world hasn't said much because deep down, many, but not all people in the Arab world would like to see Hamas defeated. Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, was quoted the other day as telling the EU people that he says Hamas cannot be allowed to win. Hamas is poison for the Palestinian people. Israel will exist, but Hamas is doing terrible damage not only to the Palestinian people themselves, but to the idea of a Palestinian state.
Okay, but let's just stick to this idea of, or the issue of how the Arab world has reacted. Adwan, let me bring you back here in the BBC World News studio. Do you feel let down by how Arab countries have responded to the past 2 weeks?
Definitely. I mean, the official Arab regime have let us down, all Palestinians and the Arabs as people. I think if there should be a much bigger reaction from the Arab governments to try and stop the Israeli aggression on Gaza. And I disagree with Mark because Hamas is not poison for the Palestinians. Hamas is trying to defend the Palestinians. How on earth you call 40 years of occupation on Gaza and the West Bank and you expect us to do nothing? Hamas always tried to make a hudna, a long-term hudna with Israel, a ceasefire, but Israel refused it. And this was 2 years ago. When Hamas won the election, Hamas offered Israel a ceasefire, but Israel refused it, and instead they went and sieged Gaza for 2 years. And now when they're firing rockets at Israel, you say why that's happening.
Well, Adwan, you're from Gaza, you live in London. We had hoped to speak to someone on a television feed from Gaza. At the moment we're having some technical problems making that connection. So let's instead bring in a caller. Jihad is from Gaza, speaking to us live on the telephone from there here on BBC World News. Gaza, Jihad, very good to speak to you. Tell us what's been happening today.
Well, all night, last night we haven't slept even a moment because the Israeli attacks were so intensive and you know, they were everywhere. And from where I live, the tanks, the Israeli tanks, military tanks, are about 2 meters away from where I live, and I had to move away because of the danger of these attacks. And where I live right now, I'm not that safe because everywhere around me the Israeli bombings are not stopping. And I just want to comment on something. Mark said that Hamas is a poison to the Palestinians and to the Israelis. Well, who asked Israel to cure us from this poison? Not that we like it, not that we hate it, but even if you want to cure this poison for your own sake, does killing over 800 innocent people mean that you're curing the Hamasi poison?
And Jihad, let me just interrupt you, because one of the main debates on the BBC News website has been about this 3-hour ceasefire, which began yesterday on Wednesday in Gaza at the Israelis' instigation. Has that made any difference? It happened again today. Has it made any difference to your experience and Gazans' experience?
It gave me a chance to get out of my house. That's the only thing that it did. And even while I was, getting out of my house, going somewhere a little bit safer, we were terrified because the sound of the airplanes above us was more terrifying than the attacks itself. I mean, can you imagine what the kids are feeling right now when they try to go out the streets and they hear these airplanes like they're about to attack? We don't trust the Israelis anymore because they have attacked a lot of people during the ceasefire.
And I suppose that issue of trust goes to the core of this crisis in the Middle East. Jihad, speaking to us live from Gaza, thank you very much indeed. Well, as you can imagine, both on the World Have Your Say blog and at BBC News Online, hundreds, if not thousands of emails have been coming in from you around the world since this crisis began. Let's read one of them. Sarah in Dublin's got in touch. The only way for a truce to be achieved is if the US puts effective pressure on Israel. As long as Israel is fully supported by the US, this can continue. Well, thank you very much indeed for that email. Let's bring in another guest. Cheryl is a lawyer based in Virginia, just outside of Washington. She's come in to the BBC studio in Washington, D.C. Cheryl, very good to have you on World Have Your Say. Let's pick up on Sarah in Ireland's comment that really the power behind this Israeli offensive is America, and that without America's support, it would be impossible.
I totally disagree. America does support Israel. However, Israel is a democracy, and Israel has the moral duty to protect its citizens.
But nonetheless, do you think that we're looking at over 700 people killed in Gaza since this offensive began? Do you think those levels of casualties would be tolerated by the United Nations, for instance, if it weren't for America vetoing so many resolutions that are coming up to the Security Council?
Personally, I feel that America's support does help Israel. However, I feel the world recognizes that Hamas is a terrorist organization. And as a result, if we want true peace in the Middle East, then Hamas has to be defeated. And as a result, if Hamas is defeated, then the Palestinian people, who are, in my opinion, prisoners of Hamas at this point, cannot have peace unless Hamas is taken care of.
It's interesting to hear that phrase used. Cheryl in Washington saying she feels that Palestinians are prisoners of Hamas. I don't know if those of you watching around the world on BBC World News agree with that. The blog address is worldhaveyoursay.com. We're going to go back to Mark in Jerusalem, Cheryl in Washington, and our guests here in the BBC World News studio in a moment. Let's go back to my colleague Chloe from the World Have Your Say team, who's watching across all of your messages.
Inundated at the moment, to be honest, Ros. I'm struggling to keep across them. But Mark from Kansas has said on the World Have Your Say blog, it seems that Israel can do whatever it wants. I honestly don't know why they continue to use conventional warfare when they and the rest of the world knows that it only fuels hate. Mandy in Cape Coral, also on the blog, says no one can just do what they want. They are accountable, just as the people who attack them are. The answer to problems are not guns and killing, neither is harbouring killers and militants. Andrew in Australia has emailed worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com.